The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, 43 minutes before I was supposed to be standing at the front of a courtroom in downtown Ottawa, swearing an oath that would make me a partner at Caldwell and Marsh. I almost didn't answer. The number was the hospital, St. Luke's, where my mother had been admitted 2 days earlier for what her doctor kept calling observation. I'd been at her bedside every evening that week, driving the 40 minutes each way after work, sitting with her while she ate whatever tasteless thing they brought on the tray, watching her fall asleep mid-sentence the way she'd started doing since the chemo began. I answered on the second ring. It wasn't her doctor. It was a nurse I didn't recognize, speaking in that careful, measured tone that people use when they're about to say something that will change the shape of your day. My mother had had a reaction overnight. Her blood pressure had dropped. They'd moved her to the ICU around 4 in the morning. She was stable now, but she was asking for me, and the attending physician wanted to speak with me in person before rounds. I stood in my kitchen in my good blazer, with my coffee going cold on the counter, and I did the math. The partnership ceremony started at 9:30. The hospital was 20 minutes in Sipsit at 9 direction. If I went to St. Luke's first, there was no scenario where I made it to the courtroom on time. None. I called my firm. I called Dominic first, because he was the managing partner, and because we'd known each other for 8 years, and I genuinely believed that he would understand. He didn't pick up. I left a voicemail explaining what was happening, then sent a text, then called the receptionist and asked her to pass the message along. I called my colleague Brent, who was also up for the same partnership consideration, and told him what was going on so that he could relay it if needed. I said I hoped to be there within the hour, that I was doing everything I could, that this wasn't what I wanted. Then I got in my car and drove to St. Luke's. My mother was propped up against 2 pillows when I got there, small and pale in the ICU light, with a cannula across her face and a monitor beeping steadily beside her. She looked at me when I came through the door and said, "You didn't have to come," in a voice that made it clear she was glad I had. I stayed for 2 hours. I spoke with the attending and the oncology nurse and signed some updated consent forms. I held my mother's hand while she slept and tried not to think about what was happening 20 minutes away in a wood-paneled room on Sparks Street. When I finally walked into the Caldwell and Marsh offices, it was 11:12. The ceremony was over. The champagne had been opened and poured and mostly consumed. Someone had ordered a tray of pastries that were now half gone. My colleagues were scattered around the main boardroom in small clusters, still in that post-event looseness that office celebrations produce. Dominic was standing near the window. Brent was beside him, and Brent had a new nameplate in his hand. The kind they engrave for you, the kind that sits on your desk and announces, in small gold letters, what you've become. I understood before anyone said a word. Dominic's expression when he saw me was not relief. It was not warmth. It was the expression of a man who had already made a decision and did not enjoy being reminded of the moment he'd made it. "Nora," he said. That was it, just my name. "My mother was in the ICU," I said. "I left you a voicemail at 7. I sent a text. I called Brent." "I know," he said. "I got the messages." "Then you know why I wasn't here." He set down his coffee cup with the particular careful deliberateness of someone who is choosing their words. The ceremony was scheduled. The partners voted last week. The announcement was always going to happen this morning, with or without any individual present. Punctuality matters in this firm, Nora. It always has. I looked at Brent. Brent looked at the nameplate in his hand. I had known Brent Calloway for 6 years. We'd started at the firm the same month, survived the same brutal first year, split a cab home from the office more times than I could count. He was at my going-away drinks when I took my secondment in Vancouver. I'd written him a reference letter for his bar application in Alberta. I genuinely thought, that we were the kind of colleagues who became something closer to friends over time. He didn't say anything. He looked at the nameplate, and then he looked at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. Dominic said that my file would remain under consideration and that there would be other opportunities. He said it the way people say things when they have no intention of following through. I drove home in the rain. I want to be honest about what those first few weeks were like, because I think there's a tendency in stories like this to skip past the ugly middle part, the part where you're not yet on the other side, where things haven't resolved themselves into a lesson yet, where it's just hard and humiliating, and you don't sleep well, and you eat cereal for dinner, more nights than you want to admit. I cried in the parking lot of a Loblaws on a Thursday afternoon because they'd rearranged the canned goods aisle and I couldn't find the tomato soup my mother liked. And that was the thing that finally broke through. I sat in my car with a basket of groceries and cried for about 10 minutes, and then I wiped my face and went back in and found the soup in a different section and drove to St. Luke's and sat with my mother while she watched the news. She knew something was wrong. She'd known from the moment I arrived that first evening after the ceremony. My mother has a particular way of looking at you when she suspects you're managing her. A slight tilt of the head, the barest narrowing of her eyes, and she deployed it the second I walked in. "How did it go this morning?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Fine." The head tilt. "Brent got it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what happened." So I told her. Not the managed version, not the version where I was already philosophical about it. The real version, including the part where I stood in the boardroom and looked at Dominic and thought about every weekend I'd worked in the last 8 years, every client I'd billed at midnight, every vacation I'd canceled or cut short, and how none of it had apparently been enough to earn a 30-minute delay on the morning my mother was in the ICU. My mother listened to all of it. When I finished, she said, "You made the right choice." "I know," I said. "Then the rest is on them." She said it simply, like it was just a fact, and I held on to that in the weeks that followed when it was harder to believe. Here's what I hadn't told anyone, including my mother. Brent had known about the partnership vote timing for 3 weeks. I knew this because he'd mentioned it offhandedly in the elevator in late October. Said something about how Dominic had told him the announcement was being moved up, that it would be happening on the Tuesday of the second week of November rather than the end of the month as originally scheduled. He'd mentioned it as though it were inconsequential information, something he was just passing along. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. It didn't occur to me until I was sitting in my car in the Loblaws parking lot, reconstructing the morning minute by minute the way you do when you're trying to understand how something went wrong. That Brent had mentioned the rescheduling to me, but had not, as far as I could tell, mentioned it to Dominic when he was relaying my message that morning. The message I'd asked him to pass along had said I was at the hospital, that my mother had had a reaction, that I hoped to be there by 10:30. It had not specified that I hadn't known the original timeline had changed, because I hadn't thought I needed to specify that. I'd assumed Brent would provide context. I'd assumed Brent was my friend. I called him that Friday afternoon. I kept my voice level. I asked him, straightforwardly, whether he'd mentioned to Dominic that the schedule change had only been communicated to me informally, without a calendar update or official notice. There was a pause on his end that lasted just a beat too long. "I passed along what you asked me to," he said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "I told him you were at the hospital." "Brent?" "Nora, I was in a difficult position. The vote had already happened. The firm needed to move forward. I didn't think it was my place to." You knew I didn't have the updated time in writing, I said. You knew that if Dominic thought I'd simply decided not to show up, it would look very different than if he knew I hadn't received official notice of the change. I think you're reading a lot into. Did you tell him? Yes or no? He didn't answer. He said something about how he hoped I understood that this hadn't been personal, how he genuinely cared about my career, how these decisions were above his level. He used the word complicated 4 times in 3 minutes. I counted. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. 6 years. I had known this man for 6 years. I took 2 days to think carefully about what I wanted to do, because my mother raised me to solve problems from a place of clarity rather than anger, and because I'd learned enough law to know that acting rashly is how people undercut legitimate grievances. What I had was this: no written notification of the schedule change. My original calendar invite showed the ceremony at 9:30. The change had been communicated verbally, informally, by Brent in an elevator 3 weeks prior. I had text messages from the morning of, to Dominic, to Brent, to the receptionist, time-stamped before 7:30, all of them explaining where I was and why. I also had the ICU admission records from St. Luke's, which showed my mother had been transferred at 4:02 a.m., and that I had arrived at the unit at 7:54 a.m. I had the consent forms I'd signed, time-stamped at 9:18. I had, in other words, documentation. I made an appointment with an employment lawyer. Her name was Suzanne, and she had the particular quality that good lawyers have. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked 2 clarifying questions, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, let's talk about what this looks like." What it looked like, she explained, was a potential violation of the firm's own partnership procedures. The process guidelines stated that partnership decisions required proper written notice to all candidates. Verbal notice in an elevator from a competing candidate did not constitute proper written notice. The firm had, in their rush to move the announcement forward, failed to follow their own documented process. The day after my appointment with Suzanne, I sent a formal letter to the firm's managing committee. Not Dominic, but the full committee, which included 3 other senior partners who'd been at the firm longer than Dominic, and who I suspected had varying degrees of enthusiasm for how this had been handled. The letter laid out the sequence of events calmly and precisely. It attached the documentation. It noted the procedure discrepancy. It did not make accusations. It asked for a formal review. The response took 8 days. It came not from Dominic, but from the committee chair, a woman named Frances, who had made partner in 1998 and who I had always found to be scrupulously fair. She asked to meet with me in person. I won't pretend that meeting was comfortable. It wasn't. It was a 2-hour conversation in a small conference room with Frances and 2 other partners, and I answered every question directly and showed them everything I'd brought, and they thanked me for coming in and said they would be in touch. What I found out later, not from Frances, but from an administrative assistant named Gwen, who I'd been friendly with for years and who had a long memory and a strong sense of justice, was that the committee had also discovered, in reviewing the partnership file, that Brent had submitted a supplementary evaluation memo about my file the week before the ceremony. The memo raised questions about my reliability and commitment to availability. It had been submitted without my knowledge and without an opportunity to respond, which was also a process violation. Gwen told me this over coffee, quietly, with the manner of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. "I thought you should know," she said. "In case it's useful." It was useful. I went back to Suzanne. I showed her what I'd learned. She read it carefully and then looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "They have a real problem." They did. Within 3 weeks of my formal complaint, the committee had conducted an internal review. Brent's memo was removed from my file. Dominic was asked to recuse himself from any further decisions related to my career trajectory at the firm. The partnership decision was formally reopened. I want to be clear. None of this happened quickly or easily. There was a period of probably 6 weeks where I genuinely did not know how it would resolve, where I was showing up to work every day and sitting in meetings with Brent and acting professionally while knowing what I knew. That was hard. There were evenings I drove to St. Luke's and sat with my mother and didn't tell her any of it because I didn't want her to worry, and she'd tilt her head at me and I'd say, "Work stuff," and she'd say, "Okay," and that was that. My mother finished her final round of treatment in January. Her scan in February came back clear. I was in the waiting room when her oncologist came out to tell her, and I could hear her from where I was sitting. That sound she made, not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, something that was just pure relief made audible. I had to step outside for a moment. The Ottawa winter was brutal that day, gray and flat, the kind of cold that settles into your shoulders before you've even registered it. I stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital and I breathed and I thought about the morning back in November when I'd stood in my kitchen in my good blazer and done the math. I would make the same choice again. I knew that then and I know it now. The partnership review concluded in March. Frances called me directly. She said the committee had voted, that the process had been properly followed this time, and that they were pleased to extend me an offer of partnership effective the 1st of April. She also said, in a tone that was carefully neutral but not unkind, that Brent had tendered his resignation the previous week. She did not elaborate, and I did not ask. I sat in my car after that call and stayed very still for a while. Outside, the first real signs of spring were starting to appear. Snowbanks shrinking back from the curbs, a bit of dirty gray slush turning into actual puddles, a few brave crocuses pushing up in the garden strip outside the parking garage. Ottawa spring, which comes late and reluctantly, but comes nonetheless. I thought about the morning I'd stood in that boardroom looking at Brent and his nameplate and trying to understand how 6 years of what I'd thought was friendship had fit inside that moment of silence. I don't think Brent is a villain. I've thought about this a lot, and I don't think it's that simple. I think he wanted the partnership badly, and he told himself that staying quiet wasn't the same as lying. And then he wrote that memo and told himself that raising legitimate questions wasn't the same as sabotage. And that's how it goes sometimes. Not a dramatic betrayal, but a series of small choices that compound into something that looks, from the outside, exactly like one. I called my mother and told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good, just that. Good." In her voice, that means she is genuinely pleased and also not remotely surprised. I have a nameplate now. It has sat on my desk for 4 months. I look at it sometimes when I'm on a difficult call or when a file isn't going the way I'd hoped. And I think about the Tuesday morning in November when I did the math and drove to St. Luke's and how for a while it looked like that decision had cost me everything. And how it turned out the thing it had actually cost me was nothing I wanted to keep. I used to think the hardest part of my job was the adversarial work, the negotiations that go sideways, the opposing counsel who argues in bad faith, the clients who are impossible to please. What I've learned is that the hardest part is the moments when the people closest to you don't show up the way you thought they would, and you have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. I decided to document it, file it properly, and let the process work. My mother would say that's just good lawyering. She's probably right.